Get started. So I'm very happy to welcome Melissa Aronczyk to give the STICE lecture of the year, and thank you to Megan, who's not in the room right now, who really helped a lot organizing. And Melissa is an associate professor in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers, and she's a leading expert in branding, and she is the author of the book Branding the Nation and editor of Blowing Up the Brand. And recently, she has been at work on a book about the entwined histories of PR and environmentalism. And she is going to talk today, I assume, about that work. The title of her talk is How Fake News, Political Spin, and Corporate PR Can Make Us Care About Climate Change. So, welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
Okay, so let me thank Adrian, Russell, and Matt Powers for inviting me to give this talk, and I want to thank also the University of Washington Department of Communication and the Department of Sociology, the Simpson Center for the Humanities, and especially the STICE family for their support of this lecture series. So as Adrian suggested, I'm going to talk to you today about a new book I'm working on that I'm very excited about. The book is called The Climate of Publicity, and it's a joint effort with Dr. Bob Brule of Drexel University and Maria Espinoza, who's a doctoral student in sociology at Rutgers, where I work. And The Climate of Publicity is supposed to be a catchy title for a set of ideas about how public communication intersects with climate change. Really, the book is not just about climate change, it's about environmentalism more broadly, because we go back almost 100 years in the book to think about how environmental change has been narrated to us in promotional media for around a century. And we haven't focus grouped that title yet, so maybe by the end of this talk you'll have a better one to give me, but for now, that's what we've got. So, I always think it's relevant to start by talking about how I got interested in this topic in the first place. So my first job, my first real job, like with a paycheck and where I had to be somewhere every day, was working in an ad agency. And at the time, I thought that was the best job in the world. Because I got paid to make up stories that would persuade people to do things. I wrote ad copy to tell you how amazing this lipstick was and how fantastic you would look if you wore it. I made TV commercials trying to show American tourists why they should come up to Canada, where I lived at the time, and how fantastic Canada was, persuade them to come up and visit, which of course doesn't really need any persuasion if you ever been to Canada. As a Canadian, I have to say. So now I'm an academic, and I write about advertising, along with other promotional media like branding, marketing, and public relations. And I'm pretty critical now about how those industries operate. But I still maintain this fascination with how persuasion works. It's an incredibly powerful tool to get people to care about something when they previously didn't care about it or maybe have never even thought about it before. So today what I want to do is think along with you about how public communication works in our contemporary lives. And I want to ask whether we can be persuaded to care about what is arguably one of the most important and most drastic issues of our time, an issue that affects all of us, climate change. Because right now, apparently, we don't care about climate change. Do we?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I kind of thought we did, actually, right? I thought we did care about climate change. Like, I think if I went up to each one of you in this room and I said, do you care about climate change? Your answer would probably be yes, right? Most of you. Hopefully not, right? Or at least you might have some vague layer of anxiety, right? Like, can I put the clamshell container in the recycling? Right? Or like, you know, what are you all going to think of me that I brought a plastic water bottle to this talk? There's like this underlying sense that we should be doing something, but maybe we just don't know what it is. But according to the media, if you look at the kind of everyday conversations that are taking place there, it actually mostly seems like no one cares. So just to get started, you maybe are aware of this Twitter storm. This is from a few months ago in July. So Chris Hayes, who is an MSNBC anchor, retweets a story about wildfires in Greece caused by extreme heat. And he tweets, read this thread, the disaster, meaning climate change, continues to come for us. And someone tweets back at him, hey, Chris, why doesn't MSNBC spend more time talking about climate change? And especially, why don't they connect the dots between climate change and extreme weather, like heat waves or hurricanes? And so Chris tweets back, well, viewers don't really seem to care about that. Every time we air a segment on climate change, viewers change the channel. And the person tweets back, really? And he says, yeah, almost without exception. Every single time we've covered climate change, it's been a palpable ratings killer. So the incentives are not great. Okay. The next day, there's a follow-up article in the New Republic. And this article zeroes in even further on media's failure to connect the dots between extreme weather and climate change. And the article cites the media watchdog group Media Matters, which did some research and found out that out of 127 segments that aired on the global heat wave on ABC, CBS, and NBC this past summer, only one mentioned the connection between climate change and extreme heat. So then the article concludes, well, addressing the crisis will require getting more people to care about it in the first place. So again, from this point of view, the reason that we don't care about climate change is that news stories about climate change aren't told in a persuasive and compelling way. And it should be up to journalists, ostensibly, to do this and to make us want to care. So that's the general tone that I observed in our news media. What about our political landscape? Do politicians care? Do we care as a result of what politicians do? Let me give you one example, also fairly recent. So last month in San Francisco, there was a global climate action summit. The summit had some fairly high-level people there. You had the governor of California, Jerry Brown. You had the executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Patricia Espinosa. You had Michael Bloomberg, who's now the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for Climate Action. The UN doesn't have any one word title. Jayashree Wickramanayake, who's also a United Nations envoy. You have a prominent business leader and a prominent political leader from China. So these are some big, powerful people, and they're all turning up at this Global Climate Action Summit. But in an article about the summit, the biggest question, the greatest worry seems to be, we're having this summit, will anyone care? The article goes on to say that even Democrats rarely this year advertised about climate change, running campaigns dominated instead by more immediate concerns about healthcare, immigration, and jobs. So I think it's fair to say that over the next month of the midterm campaigns, we're not going to be seeing a lot of conversation about climate change because it isn't polling. Okay, so to summarize what we've seen so far, I can summarize it pretty quickly. It's unclear whether climate change is a pressing issue for individuals, but maybe we care, but maybe we don't. It's not a pressing issue for our media because it's a ratings killer. And it's not a pressing issue for our politics because it's a votes killer. So in conclusion, nobody cares. This is the conclusion we're trying to work with here. So my talk today can now be reframed. I can now start talking about why do we keep being told that we don't care when there's quite a lot of evidence to the contrary. Because it doesn't really matter how far back you go in time, there's evidence throughout history that different publics have cared quite a lot about the environment. Whether this was in Cold War era fears of eco-catastrophe, whether this was Malthusian anxiety about overexploitation of natural resources, even in classical religious writing on apocalypse, we detect care for the environment. This is just one example, one I really like from Richard Grove's book called Green Imperialism, which is about environmental care in the 17th century over fears of things such as deforestation brought about by, in this case, the East India Company trade, massive imperial trade. So there's one thing that's common to all of the slides that I've shown you up until now about climate change being a ratings killer or a votes killer. And that's that they're not really about the environment. They're about communicating about the environment. And that's not the same thing. In our hyper-mediated, always on our phones, daily lives, where we mainly seem to decide what matters based on the media we're exposed to, we've turned the environment from a problem of human existence into a problem of information. And so what has come to matter more than anything for our politics and our media is how we communicate about the environment, and to what extent this communication affects what we believe and whether we care. Now, my research is about how strategic communication works. And what I've started thinking about is just how effective strategic communication has been at shaping how we understand environmental problems and what we do about them. So for the last 3 years, what my colleagues and I have been doing is researching the connections between the history of the American public relations industry and the history of environmentally compromising industries in the United States, like petroleum, chemicals, and tobacco. And what we're finding is that the PR industry and environmentally compromising industries grew up together. The PR industry cut its teeth, so to speak, on finding ways to mediate the environment to different publics for their mainly, at the time, corporate clients. And this is because the corporate clients, at least initially, were the ones with the most to lose when publics started to become anxious about environmental protection. If you think about the monopoly companies of the early 20th century in industries like rail, steel, or coal, these industries faced considerable anxiety among Americans, at least initially because of their size and their power. Public relations, we could argue, emerged out of this anxiety, charged with a mission to invest corporations with a soul. At least that's how the historian Roland Marchand has put it in a wonderful book on the history of corporate PR. So this is one ad from his book. In the 1920s, here's my potted history of PR and environmentalism. In the 1920s, publicity campaigns mostly positioned industries as effectively controlling nature. And industrial science was promoted to all kinds of publics, so everyday publics and political publics, as enriching our lives, not as harming our air or our water, of course. By the 1950s, see that well enough, air pollution was a much more prevalent concern. Companies had no choice but to respond to public fears of a changing environment. The historian Joe Conley has pointed out, though, that throughout the 1950s, the group producing and disseminating the most information about air pollution was the chemical manufacturers industry, an industry trade group dedicated to protecting the interests of all the chemical companies in the United States. So the Chemical Manufacturers Association, and other trade associations representing the chemical and petroleum industries got deeply involved in managing issues related to environmental problems. They produced documents like these that were passed out to state, local, and federal officials working on air pollution. So this is early stage lobbying. And the CMA didn't only produce reports. Of course, they organized conferences, they organized workshops with political figures, concerned citizens, and union representatives to further dialogue about the problem of air pollution and how to solve it, as long as the solution included corporations in a position of authority. By the 1980s, you start seeing so-called voluntary compliance initiatives by industry groups and companies, also known as corporate social responsibility. Right? This is ways for companies to show that they care without having to resort to regulation or legislation. And what these are essentially are environmental benchmarking systems for companies to measure their environmental progress and to communicate these measures to their publics. So essentially, over the last 100 years, PR has gotten better and better at representing environmental politics as information politics, which has meant that very complex problems of environmental destruction are often reduced to problems of information and communication, so that the people whose expertise is in information and communication can be positioned as the experts who solve the problem. But I think we all know that the environment is not a problem of information. It's a problem of infrastructure. It's a problem of resources. It's a material problem that has both immediate and very long-term consequences. It's not just about information. But we all seem to act as though sometimes it is. And I think PR has a lot to do with that. Before I go on, I want to maybe stop here and say a little bit about how I'm thinking about public relations, because one of the things that's happened as we've done this research is that we started realizing we need a somewhat more expanded idea of what PR is. It's not just limited to this kind of bathroom vision that you might have when you think about PR. So what is PR? Public relations is essentially a strategic, instrumental, and outcome-oriented way of relating to publics, hence the name. It's a set of techniques, we could even call it maybe a technology, that makes communication more disciplined and more controlled, even as it claims to represent democratic virtues and values like transparency and dialogue. And right now it seems to me that this very controlled structure, this way of thinking about publics and relating to them, has been totally absorbed by our news media and by our political system. We could argue that it's even come to characterize how we communicate with others in our everyday lives in public. Of course, it's not news to any of you if I point out that we currently live in a very public-oriented culture. I tended in my own work to call this promotional culture, because it seems to me that when we communicate with one another in public, what we are mostly trying to do is to promote ourselves or a certain idea to somebody else. Now, the Enlightenment philosophers, I won't go too far down this road, but the Enlightenment philosophers, people like Immanuel Kant, believed human reason needs communication with others in order to arrive at the most principled decisions, and that we therefore would seek publicity for its own sake. In other words, we need to air our ideas, right? We need to test them out in public in order to see whether our decisions or our ideas make sense. But if you look at Twitter or at political debates, I don't think we want publicity so that we can arrive at a reasonable decision a lot of the time. We don't see publicity as a good in itself. Instead, these days, we tend to see publicity as the means to an end. And that end, these days, is power and influence at different levels. But this is not Machiavelli, right? This is how most people communicate today. When people talk about managing their brand, this is what they're saying. You know, when your university tells you you have your university brand, when you get told you have your brand on social media, this is really what you're being told. That you need a strategic, disciplined, controlled, and outcome-oriented image to present to the public. Scholars like Nick Couldry have called this the crisis of voice, where our media seems to give us all the power to speak, but only within very narrow ideas of what matters. But I think it's, again, pretty obvious to most of us that all the talking, all the information that we currently have at our disposal has not led to better information or better knowledge. So, okay, let me take these ideas now back into the realm of climate change and my idea of this climate of publicity. One thing that happens in a climate of publicity is that what's true is really not the point. I'm sorry. That seems to be how it shakes up. In a climate of publicity, the goal is not to access the truth, it's to gain legitimacy. But legitimacy is a relative proposition. It's what the sociologist Mark Zucman calls a pragmatic concept. Legitimacy is not a quest for truth or facts. It's a way to use concepts of truth or facts to persuade others that you're right. So it's a subtle shift, but I think it's a pretty important one. But here's the problem when you value legitimacy over truth. When you value legitimacy over truth, you get this. Does everybody know what's going on here? Just in case. So this is Kellyanne Conway, the spokesperson for President Trump, and that's Chuck Todd, host of Meet the Press on NBC. And this screenshot is from a few days after Donald Trump's inauguration, when there was some debate over the size of the crowd at the inauguration, you might recall. And so Chuck Todd says, why did Sean Spicer, the press secretary at the time, why did he lie? I said, why did he lie? And she says, he didn't lie. He said, no, it's a falsehood. And she says, oh, Chuck, don't be overly dramatic about it. You're saying it's a falsehood, but Sean Spicer simply provided alternative facts. Okay, well remember this scene, right? This is not a great example because it's in such bad faith. We can talk about that at any time. But my point is that the responses to this kind of rhetoric have unfortunately helped contribute to the problem. Right, let me show you what I mean. So this is from, this is a photograph of a protest sign during the March for Science in Copenhagen in 2017. And the claim here is, as you can see, there are no alternative facts, right? There is no such thing as alternative facts. There's truth and there are lies. And I don't know, you can't maybe see with the color, but so L-I-E-S is highlighted in red here, right? So truth and lies, okay. It's very clever, right? And in this case, because it's the March for Science and because clearly these people are also protesting the current American administration, science is what has the truth, right, in this image. Whether we're talking about climate change or any other scientific situation, in this case, science has the truth. But we've all seen what happens when you claim or try to overcome something like climate denialism with science as the ultimate truth. There's two things that always happen. The first one is everybody wheels out their scientist. I have a scientist, you have a scientist, we all have scientists, and they all have truths, right? And we've all seen these debates take care in various ways. These are screenshots from a single ExxonMobil television commercial that's on YouTube right now about how they're using algae to make all kinds of new discoveries about biofuels. Okay, so everyone has a scientist, the first problem. The second thing that happens, though, is that people feel, or at least can claim to feel, challenged in their core beliefs. And that's a different kind of problem, because when you start challenging people based on their beliefs, you're not going to start having a very positive conversation. And you're certainly not going to convince them of where the truth lies. The wonderful philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote an essay in the New Yorker magazine in 1967, and I think I've read it 16 times now, and I keep reading it over and over again, just to partly make sure I understand it, and also partly because it's got so much in there for us today. And one of the things she's observed is that the fundamental disjuncture between truth and politics is that the purpose of politics, the raison d'etre of politics, is to take into account the public's opinion. And so the insistence on truth in the realm of politics can seem stubborn and coercive. She even says despotic. What people hear when you argue about truth and facts is this is not subject to debate. But debate in a democratic society is endemic to political life. So we're talking about two fundamentally opposed or contentious ways of thinking about the world. And so what happens is these kinds of arguments suffer. I have to circle back now to the title of my talk. How, given all of this, can fake news, political spin, and corporate PR make us care about climate change? So I wish I had a big reveal. I hope you don't see this as a cop-out. But my answer is that they already do. Thank you. No, let's think about it this way. Consider how much we're not supposed to care about climate change based on what I showed you at the beginning of this talk. Okay? Consider how dedicated our media and our politics are to creating fragmented publics. Right? We're constantly being told that we're all being fragmented as publics, whether that's in terms of how voting gets set up, disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, all the rest of it, or whether that's in terms of the different islands of media consumers who don't all consume the same information. Consider how dedicated these systems are to maintaining an ongoing sense of antagonistic and polarizing debate. Our media, even at its best, always has to be, because of its nature, about presenting both sides of an issue. And our two-party political system in the US is all about reinforcing the differences between parties. So again, consider how bad climate change is supposed to be for ratings and votes. And then think about all of the examples we constantly are being shown of issues related to climate change and how often we're worrying about it. The one thing that's constant in my research of the last 100 years of public relations or public communication around climate change is that it's actually been very hard to ignore how much we care about climate change. A tremendous amount of money has been spent on spin and lobbying and professional communication to deal with our concern about climate change. I said earlier that our media and our politics essentially operate as a system of public relations. They create publics that they can then relate to, whether these are different media publics or different voting publics. Our information sources shape what facts we're supposed to pay attention to. To use the old adage, they may not shape what we think, but they certainly shape what we think about. But the problem is here. This politics of information is not very good at dealing with what we care about. If we think about public relations in its broadest sense, public relations as the powerful institutions that create and manage publics around major social and political issues, can we recognize how public relations tries to persuade us to focus on the gap between facts and fiction, truth and lies, who's right and who's wrong? And then, can we try to move away from this either-or information system so that instead of trying to think about what is true and who is right, we move toward paying attention to what we care about, to focus less on matters of fact and more on what the sociologist and scientist Bruno Latour has called matters of concern. I mostly put this picture up because I just think it's so great. Bruno Latour is actually a really weird person for me to invoke at this stage because those of you who know his work and his career, it's been largely built on trying to show how scientific facts are constructed. He spent a lot of time in laboratories arguing that science laboratories are often trying to create knowledge and provoke habits that maintain controversy even when there isn't always controversy. And if there's one thing that can be characterized as a controversy, or an artificial controversy, as he put it, it's got to be global warming, climate change. But Bruno Latour has realized something at this stage in his life, and that's that if your goal is to show how people's truths are constructed, you don't leave them with anything to hang on to. Everything you believed is wrong. Everything you care about is wrong. So when Latour says that maybe we ought to focus less on matters of fact and more on matters of concern, I think what he means is that there's a lot of effort expended in keeping climate change alive as a thing in the world that still exists, that's a thing despite all of the ways that we ostensibly are not supposed to be caring. We're busy people. We're constantly distracted. We have 9,000 other things to think about on any given day. And yet climate change isn't going away as a concern. It's definitely not going away up there, but I mean as a concern that we all have. And even within our short lifetimes, environmental change has steadily become a greater and greater matter of concern to a greater and greater number of people in the world. So I think we do care. I think we care about the environment that we live in and about acting environmentally, whatever that means to us. It doesn't mean we always recycle our water bottles, and it definitely doesn't mean we're all going to vote the same way. But maybe what it means is that if we start taking the disagreements as a sign of care instead of a sign of stagnation, we can start acting on the common concerns that we all have for leading a meaningful life and for caring and protecting what matters. So I'm happy to answer some questions if you have any. Or yes?
Yeah, you said that media is about, like the way it's constructed is about presenting two sides. I'm curious, why is that, and then why does it have to be that way?
Well, I know the people in the room have maybe have better answers than I do, but journalism is predicated on the notion of objectivity. And the notion of objectivity is supposed to be about saying, well, we need to solicit what different publics think about a particular issue. We can't present the news according to one side. We have to present the news and solicit different points of view. So some studies have been done that suggest that that's actually increased the problem around reporting on climate change, because if you find the scientist who says climate change is real and the planet is steadily warming, you then have to find the scientist who doesn't say that and air their views as well. And some people have said, well, that's completely lopsided. If there's 97% of scientists who say global warming is a real thing and 3% who don't, why are you giving equal airtime to these two? But that has tended to be, because of the conventions of journalism, something that journalists have been forced to do. Did that answer your question?
Well, I wonder, does it necessarily have to be that way?
Yeah, increasingly people have said no. People have said that, that's contributed to the problem.
Right.
Do you need, so, and there's been some very funny, late night TV show presentations on that kind of thing. Some people have argued that what needs to happen instead is, okay, the baseline is climate change is a reality. Now, how do we connect it to other issues, like that connect the dots thing I showed with, okay, connect it to extreme weather. When there's a hurricane, show to what extent. The trick there, of course, is that science is also not, they don't like to say, yes, there's a direct cause between this and the other. There's always this, I don't want to say equivocation, but a recognition that it's hard to demonstrate cause when it comes to that, which is one reason why journalists have been a little bit shy of saying there's a direct relationship between one and the other. But sometimes it's been about, to the point I'm trying to make about care, collecting different communities together and showing different ways that it matters in their communities. So for instance, for different communities of faith, showing how climate change matters in those communities and trying to report on what different communities of faith are doing. One of the scholars who's coming to tomorrow is that Seth Lewis has started writing about journalism, trying to focus less on this kind of facts, lies dichotomy and more on communities and what local communities care about, trying to report in that way, showing that journalists can exchange with the communities that matter to them. So I have seen some really interesting new ideas of what engagement should look like for a journalist, and how they can kind of move the needle on that.
A little concerned about this focus on
Yes.
concern. You started with a couple of examples of what people cared about historically. You mentioned the Malthusian disaster. I think you even talked about Book of Revelations. And you mentioned
Not specifically, but
yeah, but,
yes, right.
and in both of those situations, one was either mythical or fictional, and the other one was a huge panic in the 60s, but ended up not coming to be true because of the Green Revolution. And so it's great that people do care about this stuff. However, the care itself either might be misplaced or might be amped up for reasons that don't make sense. And I'm just wondering, when I'm looking at some of the examples you point out where corporations are being proactive in trying to put their own scientists up there in white lab coats, it's fundamentally about making sure they don't lose power to too much popular care that will almost regulate them, right? And so I'm wondering, there still seems to be room for fact here. I mean, there's different ways to tell stories about this. You could say perhaps the refugee crisis from Syria, some people say, was caused by climate change. And so if you want to address conservative communities who you don't want to threaten their sense of identity or being, you could say, well, if you're so concerned about refugees and immigration, some of that was caused by climate change, so we should care more about climate change. And throw a little bit of fact and a little bit of care in there.
Yeah. I'm trying to be provocative. I don't mean let's throw facts out the window.
Yeah.
I should be careful about that. I don't mean to say facts don't matter. They matter a lot. There's stuff that's really taking place. Let me address, I think there's kind of two things there. One is this connect the dots problem, right? Why can't we make a better case for all of the different things going on in the world that are in some way related to climate change, and for the people who are experiencing them, very directly related, right? So it's not what does the scientists say about direct cause, it's more like these people are being forced to leave their homes because there is no more, there are no more trees. There's like very specific things you can point to. So part of it, we could argue, has to do with reporting, although I don't know if I want to put the burden always on the shoulder of journalists, because I don't want to reduce it to that. I think there are other ways that we can make that meaningful, make that matter. But part of it, I think, is also that the symbolic nature of why climate change matters is abstract, and I think for that reason sometimes very challenging to many. Because it's invisible, we have to conjure it up constantly, right? We have to constantly be showing all of these ways that it really matters. And from what I understand, it seems that appealing merely to the science, which is what seems to be the default when it comes to facts, we appeal to the science, is something that terrifies people even more because they feel like they can't relate to it. So I wonder if there's a way for the narrative to be about the relating and not so much about the science. And although I don't want to say we shouldn't take into account the science, I mean, it's an ongoing problem. To your earlier point about it's classical writings and what happened in the 60s, and the era in a way has its own symbolic way of representing the environment or environmental care. I take heart from people like Tony Wieserowitz, who've talked about images of nature over centuries. And he says things like, we used to think that progress was a picture of a smokestack. Right? That was the 19th century picture of progress. The picture of progress today is usually an image of a tree. So he says, in a way, if you take this kind of long view, we actually do, we have moved the needle. We do actually have a much stronger sense of environmentalism as a core need in our lives, or nature. And when we think of nature, we think of something good. We don't think so much in the old, nostalgic, preservationist, conservationist way. My point with those examples was just to say that this symbolic nature of the environment matters at every stage of our lives, and it's represented differently. But maybe we can bring it back. Yes.
So thank you for your talk. I have a deep concern for this issue on many different levels of how to communicate climate change and everything that goes along with it. And right now, are you familiar with what's on our ballot in Washington State?
No.
It's Measure 1631, and there's a lot of confusion about it, and it's carbon tax. But I was just over at another department within the University of Washington, and scientists actually can't come out because it's directed from government what they can say and what they can't say. So a citizen scientist can speak, but as part of an organization or as part of, like, to give credibility to something. So I think that science, when we're talking scientists and what they can or can't say, they can't go on the record sometimes. And that is a very large issue that we're not talking about, you know, and that is like a problem with the whole institution of science in what scientists feel they can actually come out and say and what they can't say.
Yeah, that's, I mean, not to mention the EPA and all the other ways
Yeah,
that
of
scientists.
everything coming down and what is being directed. So that's where it becomes like more than politics and more than this dissemination of information. And for the average person, unless you know the history of where the money is coming from and why they have to be true and why they can't talk about certain issues, like this is another reason and another layer to why we're not maybe hearing the truth of, and I don't like using that word, truth, the reality, the connecting of the dots and the reality of the situation of what our world is experiencing.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I don't know this particular proposition, but I mean, I think that any situation where, if I try to turn it around, this is probably not going to make you feel better, but a situation where certain groups of people are not allowed to speak is this crisis of voice I'm talking about. It helps us index how important this issue is and how much is at stake for certain groups or certain organizations, that these people who are ostensibly outside of the bounds of politics are not being allowed to have a voice and to express their expertise. So thank you. This is something for me to think about in this model that I'm doing. Yes?
I've worked in public relations for most of my career and in corporate social responsibility for a large multinational or global company for the past nearly decade. And so this is kind of, you know, during the headlights for me. But I wonder what you think about the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Global Compact as frameworks that maybe can elevate some of what, you know, I like to think I'm doing good work in the world, but I know that it doesn't go as far as I would like it to, and so I look to those frameworks as something that is something positive, that at least some of this work can be elevated and it can be used in a community where it might actually go further than I can do right now.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, you know, I'm very conflicted about this too, because I'm also, one of the things I was really concerned to do with this project was not to only think about public relations as something corporations do. It's something that everybody does, not just us as individuals, but nonprofits, foundations, philanthropic organizations, and groups of people who really want to do good in the world and help the environment use public relations. So one of the things that we did was interview a lot of people who run climate organizations and say, how do you communicate? How do you conceptualize public relations? Many of those groups use the Sustainable Development Goals. Those you don't know, these are United Nations. I think there are 18 goals that they've set up and they've articulated them, and a lot of different organizations have said, okay, we're going to pick one of these goals and we're going to work toward it, and that's going to be our mandate over the next certain number of years, and we're going to develop communications campaigns or other sustainable development campaigns to work towards those goals. At the same time, and so I think there's some good work. So the short answer is I think there is some good work taking place. I'm always a little bit skeptical of corporate social responsibility. I just can't shake it. I can't, the Walmart thing, it's like, I keep hearing these stories when I was interviewing people. They'd say, okay, well, Walmart is now the biggest importer of solar panels in the world. And so that's so great. They're importing solar panels. But they're still Walmart. There's still, you have to recognize that these corporations are still about their stakeholders and their bottom lines, no matter how many solar panels they can install. So I'm a little skeptical. Then I've also seen some really interesting initiatives. I won't go on and on, but just briefly, one of the things we're working on for this book is how the United Nations has now been tapped by certain private companies to act as a kind of broker, so that these private companies' data can be used for climate, among other purposes. And so the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals are held up as this kind of apolitical, doing good metric, environmental benchmark that everyone can then feel good about and move toward. But the project that we've been looking at is essentially how governments are looking at replacing their national data collection with private corporate data that is proprietary and only asks certain questions about people, and using that, you know, to do things like climate modeling or looking at in a hurricane where are certain groups of people and how can they, and I'm very worried about that.
Yeah.
I'm not excited about that. I think there's a lot of problems with trying to replace government, state, you know, citizen-oriented, equal access and opportunity alternatives with private company initiatives. Because again, they're just not about equal treatment. They don't have a mandate to deal with it. Yes?
So you really focused in this presentation on sort of the climate science side of the problem, and I was wondering how you think about these issues when it relates to the solution side of the problem. Because just like climate science is like broad and diffuse, the solution is also this global, diffuse. It's really hard to have a tangible impact as an individual. So how much do you think that sort of solution side, having similar issues, contributes to the exact problems that you were talking about?
Okay, I want to make sure I understand your question. The solutions part, you mean like what can I as an individual do?
Yeah, what can I as an individual or as a global society? Like generally as an individual, there's not a whole lot I can do because I can't change the fact that if I live in Detroit, most of my energy is coming from coal-fired power
I
plants.
see. One of the things I do to take heart is to leave the United States. Does not, probably not the answer you were looking for. But I do take heart to see that in most other places in the world, climate change is a very, very serious initiative, and there are many infrastructural, resource-based things that are taking place. That's not a good answer for what do I do for living in Detroit. One thing that I have been thinking about is where to focus my energy to, again, not only feel like something is happening in the United States, but also to say, what can I do as an individual? And I actually have some slides. I was going to talk a little bit more about this. Let's see if I have this, but yeah. So one place to look to see where change is really taking place, where this is really, you can see that people really care, is in the insurance industry. If you want to look at people who really care, look at what insurance companies are doing right now. So this is Hudson Yards in New York. This is a massive new construction project, very fancy on the west side. And you can't see it too well in this image, but it's been entirely built on a platform. This is part supposed to be an architectural wonder because there are railroads underneath. So they built it all on top of something. And they don't really say it, but it has a lot to do with storms, drainage, flooding, right? Some very, very serious problems that happen when you make these massive multi-billion-dollar constructions right near the Hudson River. So I took a look at what, you know, this is Swiss Re, it's a global reinsurer, and, you know, they are very, very, very concerned about how to insure different companies, different building projects about climate change. Our mayor's office, see another example, that's just to depress everybody, there's flooding in the New York City subway station. But if you look at New York City, it has these massive climate policy and resilience programs, and there are a lot of initiatives that are actually being undertaken in order to resolve or at least mitigate the disaster caused, potential disaster caused by issues of infrastructure and resource in cities, because it has to be done. So again, it's not a great answer to your question, right? What can one individual do? But it is an answer to the question of, are people really caring about this? I think that it becomes clear that the answer is really yes. And that maybe this will start to have impacts because it already starts to have impact, but because things like this happen on more or less a regular basis in New York, I think what's going to increasingly happen is individuals are going to feel like there are things that they can do. Because you just won't have a choice, right, if your subway's flooded. I'll leave that up. Yes.
I'm trying to reconcile the fact that you say we do care about climate change on sort of a moral level, but that it is also a ratings killer and not something to run your political platform on.
Right.
So how do we, if I were running for office and I cared about climate change, how would you recommend I message that while not ignoring the severity of the issue, but infusing those values into my platform.
Yeah. So I think this comes back to the question we had earlier, which has to do with not just dot connecting, but also demonstrating why it matters to the different communities or groups that you care about or that are your constituency. There has to be, there's no end of narratives that one can actually generate. And I think that groups, I'm thinking of a group like Climate Nexus, which is a kind of public relations group on the climate side, it's based in New York, has done some really exceptional work on trying to rally together different communities. To come back to the theory for a second, just because this is how I think about this, when Bruno Latour talks about matters of care, he talks about how much effort needs to be expended to make a thing continue to matter. So climate change is this thing that keeps having layers built onto it. And there are ongoing ways in which climate change matters. You can't establish direct cause, but you can make connections for people who are affected by things like getting to work on the subway. And to me, I've become a strategic communications expert almost by default by doing this kind of work, but I haven't myself had to be the person creating those messages. But I have seen, so groups like Climate Nexus, there are other kinds of groups that are a little bit more underground that see, as they put it, the climate as their client, and have evolved a lot of public relations about doing exactly what you're describing, finding all the ways to make climate matter in different media and political sources. And there are, those people are actually, it's not like, what if there were one day a politician who cared about climate change? There are many, many politicians out there claiming that they care about climate change. It's just that because it's so often this political polarizing issue, I almost feel like there's one party that's almost like it's the third rail and they're not supposed to touch it. That doesn't mean they don't care about climate change. It means it's not expedient for them in a short-term political campaign when they only have a certain amount of time in office or a certain amount of time in which to get votes. They feel they have to prioritize otherwise. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be helpful.
My bit concern about this PR frame of public climate change efforts is the matter of truth or fact, the matter of concern. I don't see that there aren't many campaigns around the concern part. A lot of public education advertisement focusing on the next generation. Your kids not going to have food, you're gonna have poverty or out of clean water, and also like basic concern like you will have higher summer electric bill. And those kind of concern targeting is very specific. But my question is how this kind of shift for matter of fact to concern evade the hard question about the cultural reflexivity. I mean, within the United States, the democracy has this kind of anything is up for debate culture. We have neutrality, journalism culture that fosters this kind of misrepresentation. Like one scientist fight against climate change, 1,000 scientists talking about climate change, and then you have them together on TV screen saying same thing. And also you have lobbyist culture, control the politics and funneling money to the politics. And all the things are very specific in American culture and social issue. And I'm really concerned if we focus too much on massage the message, it will continue like this forever.
Yeah, so you're saying like, why are we focusing too much on the public relations? We should be focusing on the other stuff? Is that essentially?
That's my concern. It's not like PR is not there, right? Good PR is not there. It's there, but why people is not listening? Right. That's the thing that concerns me most.
Yes, I mean, I share your concern. One of the this kind of exceeds the bounds of public relations, but one set of really big concerns we have that you mentioned that I didn't really talk about here is the money, right? Is the, if you read Jane Mayer's Dark Money, the Coke industries have tentacles in a lot of places, so that many other industries, corporate public relations doesn't just manipulate, it hides things in very problematic ways, not just Muslim scientists, but all kinds of other things. It starts to feel at some point like we're in these environments where everything is sponsored around us by powerful interests. And how can we even emerge from that? One small voice, and then there's all this money on the other side, and so on. And that's limiting. Those are the kind of things that can keep people awake at night. But climate change it's a global human issue. It's not an American, it is an American issue, but it's not exclusively an American issue. So, on the one hand, we can try to think in a more cosmopolitan way and try to connect to other, radically different ways of thinking about this that are currently in play in places outside the United States, and see how we can draw inspiration from them to the extent that that's something that we want to do. I think that focusing on what public relations is up to helps me think about the extent to which we want our information or our messaging to hit the right thing. And again, the last 3 years, what the people I've been speaking to have been insisting upon is, it's about awareness and behavior change and psychology, and I'm not so sure that it is. And so one of the reasons I want to focus on public relations so much is to look at all of the things that fall outside of the public relations model and say, here are maybe the areas where things can happen outside of the messaging and the information. Because I think you're right. I don't think we're ever going to get the message exactly right. In fact, that's not even the right way to think about it, because we have so many different kinds of publics who care about so many different kinds of things. Yes?
Are you familiar with Katharine Hayhoe?
Yeah, vaguely, the name, but I don't.
Okay, she's a climate scientist in Texas who is also an evangelical Christian. She often speaks to conservative church groups and so on the topic of climate change. And she has a wonderful series of videos called Global Weirding that I recommend. But I've seen her speak, and one of her key points is that you will not change these people's minds with facts, as you've said. That, but by pouring a bunch of facts on them. I mean, they assimilate facts, but it can't be your basic strategy. Instead, she sits down with the groups, and from her own insight into what their culture and their community has as its core concerns, she helps them relate climate change to their concerns. And so many of these groups have a real concern about the poor and about helping people in need and so on. And that's how she can make the connection. So my basic point is different communities will have different core concerns and values, and your PR needs to relate to those concerns and values within that community, which may be very different in a beautiful little Baptist congregation in Georgia versus a bunch of Presbyterians in New York, so or a bunch of politicians in New York. So anyway.
Yeah. So I need to watch these videos.
They're fun.
They're
They're very good.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, maybe if there's any more questions, we can take them out into the hall with refreshments. Thank you so much.
Thank you.